Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a really interesting case, Moore v. Texas. It's been back and forth a bit.
It certainly has.
And the core question is pretty stark, isn't it? Did the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals correctly decide that Bobby James Moore doesn't have an intellectual disability?
Exactly. Which means, under Atkins v. Virginia, he'd be eligible for the death penalty. And, well, the Supreme Court has now weighed in on this twice.
Okay. So let's start with the latest outcome. What did the Supreme Court decide this time around?
Well, they reversed the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals.
Again,
okay. Yeah. The Supreme Court found basically that the Texas court's decision that Moore wasn't intellectually disabled just didn't align with the Supreme Court's own previous ruling in this exact same case.
So they felt the Texas court didn't follow their instructions from the first time.
Pretty much. The court's main opinion, the per curiam one, really highlighted that the Texas court kept using analytical methods the Supreme Court had already said were improper. Chief Justice Roberts even wrote separately, concurring, just to, underline how the lower court had misapplied their earlier guidance.
But it wasn't unanimous.
No, not at all. Justice Alito wrote a dissent, joined by Justices Thomas and Gorsuch. They argued the Supreme Court was maybe overstepping by reviewing what they saw as factual findings by the Sturt Court.
Okay.
And they also suggested that, well, perhaps the first Moore decision from the Supreme Court hadn't been perfectly clear, which might have contributed to the Texas court's difficulty.
Right. So there's a bit of blame going around, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Let's unpack the history then. This clearly didn't just appear at the Supreme Court.
No, it's got quite a backstory. It started in the Texas trial court, and that court actually did find Moore intellectually disabled.
So initially, he was found ineligible for the death penalty under Atkins.
Correct. But then the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stepped in and reversed that trial court decision. That's when the Supreme Court got involved the first time. They looked at the Texas Appeals Court's reasoning, found it lacking, vacated the decision, basically wiped it clean and sent it back down.
With instructions, presumably.
Yes, with specific guidance on how to analyze intellectual disability claims, telling them to keep the court's analysis in mind.
It came back.
It did, because the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, on remand, looked at it again and reached the same conclusion. They still found Moore was not intellectually disabled.
Wow. Okay, so that's what prompted this second trip up to the Supreme Court.
Exactly. It's pretty unusual for the court to have to review the same state court decision on essentially the same issue twice after giving guidance.
So what is the absolute core of this disagreement? What keeps causing this clash between the Texas court and the Supreme Court?
It really boils down to how they're assessing one specific criterion for intellectual disability: adaptive deficits.
Okay, remind us of the criteria again.
Sure. The court generally looks for three things based on clinical standards. First, significant deficits in intellectual functioning often linked to IQ scores, though not solely.
Right.
Second, significant deficits in adaptive functioning, meaning how a person copes with everyday life demands. And this is the real battleground here.
And the third?
And third, that both of these deficits appeared before the person reached adulthood.
Got it. So in that first Supreme Court decision, they must have pointed out where Texas went wrong on adaptive deficits.
They did. They identified 5 specific errors in how the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had initially analyzed Moore's adaptive functioning.
Okay, let's walk through those. What was error number 1?
First, the Supreme Court said the Texas court put too much emphasis on Moore's adaptive strengths rather than giving proper weight to his significant adaptive deficits.
Focusing on what he could do rather than the documented limitations.
Exactly. Second, they criticized the focus on improvements Moore might have shown while in prison.
The prison context issue.
Right. The Supreme Court warned that prison is a highly structured environment, and improvements there don't necessarily reflect someone's ability to function in the outside world. Very different setting.
Makes sense. What was the third error?
Third, the Texas court seemed to suggest that Moore's difficult background things like academic failure and childhood abuse somehow detracted from finding an intellectual disability. The Supreme Court said, no, clinical standards often see those as consistent with or even contributing factors.
Kind of flipping the logic there.
Sort of, yeah. Fourth, the Texas court seemed to require Moore to prove his adaptive problems weren't caused by a personality disorder.
But people can have both, right?
Precisely. The Supreme Court stressed that clinical practice recognizes co-occurring conditions. You don't have to rule out one to diagnose the other. That was a departure from the standard approach.
Okay, and the fifth error. This sounds like a big one.
It was. The fifth was the Texas court's reliance on something called the Brison O'Factors. These came from an older Texas case. The Supreme Court found these factors weren't based on current medical standards and relied more on, well, lay stereotypes about disability, things like whether someone can lie effectively or if the crime seemed complex.
Okay, so Brison was a major problem identified by the Supreme Court.
A very major problem.
So fast forward, case goes back to Texas. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals says, okay, we get it. What did they claim to do differently?
Well, on paper, they said they would abandon those Brison factors, and they stated they'd use the current clinical standards, specifically the DSM-5 criteria.
DSM-5, the Standard Diagnostic Manual. Sounds like progress.
It sounded like progress. But when the Supreme Court reviewed the new decision, they found that the analysis, despite the new labels, still looked remarkably similar to the old flawed approach.
So the substance hadn't really changed, even if the terminology did.
That was the Supreme Court's conclusion. It seemed like the underlying thinking hadn't shifted much.
Can you give specific examples of how the Supreme Court saw the Texas court repeating those earlier mistakes?
Sure. For instance, the Supreme Court again found the Texas court overemphasized Moore's supposed adaptive strengths. They pointed to things like his communication skills in prison, his reading and writing, even mentioning legal papers he filed himself.
But was there proof he wrote them alone?
That was the Supreme Court's point. There wasn't clear evidence he wrote them without significant help. They also mentioned his ability to copy things, which isn't really high-level functioning.
Right. What else?
They noted his testimony was called coherent, but also pointed out he'd been heavily coached by his lawyers beforehand.
Okay.
And again, there was a heavy reliance on his behavior in prison. Things like, making purchases at the commissary or refusing certain tasks.
The same prison context issue cropping up again.
Exactly. The Supreme Court just kept reiterating its caution against giving that too much weight compared to his lifelong functioning outside prison.
What about the personality disorder issue? Did that resurface?
It did, in a way. The Supreme Court felt the Texas court still seemed to demand that Moore show his social deficits were purely due to intellectual limits, not emotional issues. Again, contrary to clinical understanding.
And the ghost of Brison? You said the Texas court claimed to ditch those factors. Did the Supreme Court think they actually did?
They really didn't think so. The Supreme Court drew some pretty direct lines between the Texas court's new reasoning and the old Brison factors.
Like what?
Okay, so the Texas court noted Moore's crime involved planning and forethought. That sounds an awful lot like a Brison factor about complex execution of a crime.
I see the parallel.
Right. And finding Moore responded rationally and coherently, that directly mirrors a Brison question about coherent responses.
Okay.
Even interpreting Moore, sometimes refusing orders in prison as showing he influences others and stands up to authority, that echoes a Brison factor about leadership potential.
So even without naming Brison, the type of analysis felt very similar to the Supreme Court.
Very similar. The court acknowledged some of these topics might be relevant clinically, but the specific way the Texas court framed them, the language used, it just screamed Brison influence.
It really sounds like the Supreme Court felt the Texas court was stuck on outdated ideas or stereotypes about intellectual disability.
That's a fair summary. The Supreme Court explicitly mentioned the continued influence of lay stereotypes.
Any examples of that?
Yeah, they pointed out the Texas court seemed to think the fact Moore had a girlfriend or held jobs weighed against him having an intellectual disability.
But clinicians say that's perfectly possible, right?
Absolutely. The clinical consensus is that people with intellectual disabilities can have relationships, hold jobs, especially with support. So relying on those as reasons to deny the diagnosis showed, in the Supreme Court's view, a disconnect from actual clinical understanding.
So summing up the Supreme Court's view on this second round.
The bottom line was that the Texas court's opinion, despite saying it used DSM-5, still relied too much on the flawed reasoning previously rejected. They looked at the whole record, especially the trial court evidence, and concluded it clearly showed Moore meets the criteria for intellectual disability.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What's the broader significance of this case? What does Moore v. Texas, especially this second ruling, tell us legally?
Well, first, it strongly reaffirms the Supreme Court's supervisory role in ensuring states actually follow the Atkins prohibition on executing intellectually disabled individuals. It's not just a suggestion.
They're enforcing their precedent.
Right. Second, it hammers home the importance of using current medical diagnostic standards like the A8 and DSM criteria, not outdated or layperson ideas. The law has to keep pace with clinical science here.
And the Brison O'Factors are definitely out.
The repeated rejection makes it crystal clear. Those factors are inappropriate for this kind of clinical assessment in a legal setting. They're seen as unreliable and potentially biased.
What else does it clarify?
It underscores that the focus needs to be on adaptive deficits, not just cherry-kicking strengths. And pre-prison functioning is key. Prison behavior needs to be viewed very cautiously, not as the main evidence.
Right. Don't let prison adaptation overshadow a lifetime history.
Precisely. And finally, it clarifies that having other mental health issues doesn't negate an intellectual disability diagnosis. Co-occurrence is common and understood clinically.
This has been a really thorough breakdown. Now, for our final segment, the 10th chair. If we were hypothetically sitting on the court for this case, how would talk testimonies rule?
Okay, taking that 10th chair, we would affirm the original trial court's finding.
Meaning Moore is intellectually disabled and ineligible for execution under Atkins.
Correct. And the reasoning really rests on the strength and depth of the evidence presented right at the beginning, at the trial level. That record showed compelling evidence of significant deficits in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior, and crucially, that these deficits started before adulthood. All three prongs met.
So prioritizing the initial detailed factual findings.
Exactly. While the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals said it was using modern standards on remand, its analysis just kept getting pulled back towards focusing on strengths developed in prison, towards skepticism about Moore's history, and you could still feel the influence of those Brison-like lay factors.
So the analysis still felt tainted.
It did. Our hypothetical ruling would stress respecting trial court findings when they're built on solid expert testimony and clinical standards. It would also, importantly, caution appellate courts. Don't substitute your judgment on complex factual determinations like this without a really clear legal error by the trial court.
And reinforce the point about prison adaptation versus lifelong deficits.
Definitely. Don't let adjustments to a highly structured prison life obscure decades of documented difficulties functioning in the real world. The goal here in our 10th chair view is to ensure Atkins protections are applied consistently and accurately based on medical consensus, not, potentially misleading stereotypes or gut feelings.
That ruling would aim for clarity and consistency in applying Atkins, grounded in clinical reality.
That would be the goal, yes.
Okay, that wraps up our deep dive into Moore v. Texas. We've really unpacked the court's reasoning, the back and forth with the Texas court, and what this all means for applying the Atkins ruling going forward. And just a reminder, as always, our discussion here, including our 10th chair perspective, is for informational purposes, for discussion. It's not legal advice, and it certainly doesn't represent the official views or holdings of the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, just our analysis of the case.
We always encourage you to read the opinions yourself and form your own conclusions. Let us know what you think. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on talk testimonies.